The copper pans gleamed under the bright lights of Whitmore and Konu. But Grace Parker could feel every stare that told her you don't belong here. In the pristine kitchen tucked deep inside New York's Upper East Side, everything sparkled. The white tiles reflected every gleam of stainless steel. Chefs moved in rehearsed precision, slicing stirring plating. The air smelled of butter shallots and veal stock simmering somewhere in the back. Grace stood quietly at her station, hands moving confidently, as she prepared the poached monkfish. She was a black woman in her early 30s, her dark skin a quiet contrast in the sea of white jackets. Her hair was wrapped neatly under a scarf, as much to protect as to signal that she stood out in a room like this. She didn't need reminding. Every glance already did that for her. Though she was the sous chef, there was always the unspoken distance. Servers brushed by without greeting. A few fellow chefs gave polite nods but avoided eye contact too long. Grace told herself she was here to cook, not to be seen. Still, some nights that lie was harder to hold. The monkfish shimmered under her blade as she sliced the broth beside it, gently simmering. Lemongrass and citrus notes rose to meet her, a recipe inspired by her grandmother's Sunday cooking back in Georgia. Grace cooked with memory-layering flavor like history. But then Philip Whitaker entered. The head chef's arrival changed the air. Tall with silver hair slicked back, Whitaker carried himself like he owned more than just the restaurant. His tailored chef's coat gleamed as much as his reputation. His eyes swept the room and paused on Grace just half a second longer than on anyone else. "Miss Parker," his voice rang across the kitchen. Grace wiped her hands quickly. "Yes, chef. You're doing the monkfish tonight." "Yes, chef. Southern French fusion inspired by—" "We don't do inspired here." He cut her off sharply. "We do French. Real French." The kitchen quieted. Grace held her voice steady. "Understood, chef. I'll adjust." He leaned closer. "Our guests expect control, not nostalgia." Then louder to the full brigade. "From today I will review all sauces before service. No off-menu suggestions. Consistency is everything." Heat crawled up Grace's neck, but she kept her expression neutral. The monkfish would not be tasted tonight. Whitaker moved down the line, complimenting others, barely acknowledging her work. Later during lineup, he introduced a new foie gras dish while glancing at Grace's hands. "Let's keep the tone consistent," he joked. Some laughed nervously. Grace kept her eyes on the floor. After service, the others left. Grace stayed behind, wiping her station slowly. The quiet allowed her thoughts to settle like dust. Lauren Martin, the young pastry chef, approached hesitantly. "That was rough today," she said softly. "You okay?" Grace met her eyes. "You ever feel like someone's already decided who you are before you speak?" Lauren hesitated, offering a weak smile before leaving. Grace turned back to her sink. The hot water scalded her fingers, but she didn't flinch. She wouldn't give them her tears. On the subway ride home, she sat between strangers who never looked her way. Her apron still carried the scent of tarragon. At home, her husband David greeted her with gentle eyes. "Rough night," Grace sighed. Chef Whitaker. First full day. Polished, poised, and full of it, controlled, efficient, and racist. David pulled her close. "You don't need his permission to exist here. I don't want to exist. I want to matter. Then keep cooking, even if it's just for yourself." That night, staring at the ceiling, Grace remembered her grandmother's hands stirring broth with care. She made a quiet promise. "If they won't make space for me, I'll build my own." The kitchen was almost empty when she mopped the floor. The copper pans reflected her blurred image. Then a voice cut the silence. "Smile for TikTok," a man sneered. "The world needs to see how high-end kitchens really work." The camera light caught her eyes as she froze. The mop video didn't just trend, it exploded. By morning, Grace Parker's world had changed. The grainy footage of her, a black woman in chef whites, mopping the floor, while a snide voice mocked her, raced across TikTok and Instagram. The caption read, "When the diversity hire ends up back where she belongs." Fine dining reality. The hashtags stung more than the laughter behind them. David saw it first. When Grace came out of the shower towel wrapped tight, he was pacing the apartment, phone in hand, eyes wide with anger. "It's everywhere," he said, voice tight. "Over 30,000 views already." And the comments, Grace raised her hand gently. "Don't read them." "But Grace," I said, "don't," she repeated, her voice softer but firm. She had read enough. The words blurred together in her mind. "This is why Michelin doesn't mix with soul food. Know your place." Finally doing what they're best at. Each one pierced like a quiet insult she'd heard her whole career, now amplified by thousands of strangers who never tasted her food. By noon, it was over 400,000 views. By evening, close to 1 million. Grace sat at the kitchen table, staring into her untouched tea, while David paced, his fists clenched. "Why aren't they taking it down?" he snapped. "Because they don't care," Grace whispered. "If I make noise, I become the angry black woman. They want that story." David knelt beside her. "Then let me be angry for you." But Grace shook her head. "My fight isn't loud, David. Not yet." The call from HR came the next morning. Grace was told to report to the office that afternoon. The HR office at Whitmore & Co. was a cold glass box beside the linen room, neutral-colored, always too bright. Inside sat Vincent, the general manager, and Dana from PR. Both smiled with the kind of corporate sympathy that felt like a performance. Vincent began adjusting his tie like it was part of his script. "We're aware of the video. It's unfortunate. Very unfortunate." Dana echoed, her smile too wide. "We just want to ensure you feel supported." Grace said nothing. She already knew where this was headed. "We're handling it internally," Vincent continued. "But for now, we ask that you don't engage publicly. We don't want this to turn into anything larger." Dana slid a document across the table. A non-disclosure agreement filled with legalese about confidentiality and brand protection. Grace's eyes stayed on the paper. "You're not taking it down, Vincent," and Dana exchanged a glance. "It's been shared too widely. The damage is done. Escalating could risk the brand's reputation." Grace's voice was calm but sharp. "And my reputation?" "You're not tagged directly," Vincent offered, as if that somehow erased her from the footage. "Most people don't even know it's you." "But they do," Grace said softly. "They see me." Dana's smile tightened. Grace tried to see it from a broader lens. Reacting publicly may reflect poorly on all of us. Sometimes silence is best. Grace stood slowly. "Silence protects you, not me." Neither of them responded. The next few days in the kitchen felt colder. Conversations quieted when she walked by. Camille Jackson avoided her completely. Andre Williams whistled softly in the corner, pretending not to notice. Only Lauren offered a whispered, "I'm so sorry," one afternoon, but even that felt like too little. By Friday, the final blow came. Grace opened her locker and found the letter folded neatly inside, her name typed at the top. "Effective immediately, we are terminating your employment. We thank you for your service and wish you well." No meeting, no conversation. just a letter. Grace stood silently, reading the words again and again as her chest tightened. Her hands were steady, but something inside her cracked. Lauren approached, breathless. "Grace." "What? They can't." Grace simply handed her the letter. Lauren read it, eyes wide with disbelief. "This is insane." But Grace had already shifted her gaze toward the kitchen doors. No one was coming. Not Vincent. Not Whitaker. No explanations. No dignity offered. She returned to her station one last time. Her knives lay in a perfect row, polished, waiting for hands that would no longer touch them. One by one, she wiped each blade gently, wrapping them in cloth with reverence. It felt like closing a book no one cared to finish. In the hallway, she passed Vincent, who offered only a stiff nod before walking away. Whitaker didn't even show. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. The sky was heavy with late autumn clouds. Cars splashed through puddles. Sirens hummed faintly in the distance. David was already waiting on the corner, eyes damp before she even spoke. She stepped into his arms. "It's done," she whispered. David held her tighter. "No," he said softly. "Not yet." The copper pans gleamed, but Grace Parker could feel every stare that told her, "You don't belong here." The kitchen of Whitmore and Coman, one of New York's most exclusive fine dining establishments on the Upper East Side, was a cathedral of pristine white tile, polished chrome, and rigid precision. Every motion had rhythm, every station was spotless. But no amount of order could smooth the quiet friction Grace felt each time she stepped inside. Grace, a black woman in her early 30s, stood behind her station, with calm hands but an alert heart. The heat from the burners barely touched her, but the weight of watching eyes made her skin prickle beneath her starched chef's jacket. Her natural hair was wrapped in a neat navy scarf, as much for function as it was armor. In this world of gleaming copper and delicate sauces, her brown skin marked her as different, and every glance reminded her. She focused on the task before her poached monkfish in lemongrass broth, a dish inspired by her grandmother's Sunday stews back in Georgia, where flavors came from memory rather than textbooks. Her blade sliced through the fish with careful precision. Citrus notes from the broth mingled with the buttery aroma filling the kitchen. The sharp scent of shallots softened in hot pans as Grace stirred, building layers of flavor like quiet symphonies. A server brushed past her without acknowledgement. Lauren Martin, the young pastry chef, offered a brief nod, but kept her eyes down as if even kindness might cost her something in this place. Grace told herself, as always, that she was here to cook, not to be liked. But the fragile peace cracked when Chef Philip Whitaker entered. Whitaker carried himself like the room bent for him. His silver hair slicked back, chef's whites tailored shoes, polished to mirror shine. His pale gaze swept the brigade with cold calculation. Every conversation softened to whispers as he approached. When his eyes landed on Grace, they held for a beat too long. "Miss Parker," he called across the floor. "Yes, chef." She wiped her hands and stepped forward. "You're responsible for the monkfish tonight." "Yes, chef. Southern French fusion inspired by—" "We don't do inspired here." Whitaker cut in sharply. "We do French. Real French." Silence settled like steam over the kitchen. Grace steadied her voice. "Understood, chef. I'll adjust." Whitaker leaned closer, voice lower, almost conversational. "Our guests pay for control, Miss Parker, not nostalgia." Straightening, he turned to address the entire room. "New protocol. From today forward, all sauces will be reviewed by me before service. No improvisations. Consistency is non-negotiable." Grace swallowed the rising heat in her chest. The monkfish would not be tasted tonight. Whitaker continued down the line praising Andre Williams for his foie gras, nodding at Camille Jackson's pot au feu, but passing Grace's flawless mise en place without a word. She saw it her work was cleaner, sharper, more disciplined, but none of it mattered here. During lineup, Whitaker unveiled a new foie gras edition for the winter menu, glancing pointedly at Grace's hands. "Let's keep the tone consistent," he said, drawing shallow laughter. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the floor tiles, steadying her breath. As the service wound down, chefs filtered out into the cold New York evening. Some offered rushed goodbyes. Most said nothing at all. Grace stayed behind, wiping down her station with deliberate care. She wasn't in a rush to leave, though exhaustion pressed into her legs. "Hey, Grace?" The voice came softly from behind. It was Lauren. She approached hesitantly, her blonde hair pulled back, hands nervously clutching her apron. "That was rough today," Lauren offered, voice small. "You okay, Race?" met her eyes, her voice low but calm. "You ever feel like someone's already decided who you are before you even speak?" Lauren hesitated, fumbling for words. "I mean, yeah, but not like that." Grace nodded tightly. "That's the part that cuts deepest. You do everything right, and still you don't belong." Lauren offered a weak, guilty smile before slipping away. Alone again, Grace turned back to the sink. The hot water scalded her fingers, but she didn't flinch. She refused to give them her tears. Not here, not now. The subway ride home was a blur of crowded bodies and hollow glances. She sat between two strangers who never looked her way. Her apron still carried the faint scent of tarragon and sweat. When she reached her small Harlem apartment, David was waiting. He looked up from his sketchpad, eyes already reading her face. "Rough night, Chef Whitaker. First full day." David set his pad aside, voice steady, polished, poised, and full of it, controlled, efficient, and racist, she whispered. David stood and wrapped her in his arms, firm and steady. "You don't need his permission to exist here, Grace. I don't want to exist. I want to matter," she murmured. "Then keep cooking. Even if it's only for yourself. Especially then." That night, as they lay in bed, Grace stared at the ceiling, long after David's breath evened into sleep. Her grandmother's hands flashed in her mind, scarred, strong, stirring broth like a quiet rebellion. Grace made herself a promise. "If they won't make space for me, I'll build my own." The kitchen was nearly empty the next evening. Only the soft hum of the refrigerators remained. Grace moved across the polished floor, mop gliding softly beneath her. The copper pans reflected her blurred image. Then came the sharp laugh behind her. "Smile for TikTok," a man sneered from beyond the service window. "The world needs to see how high-end kitchens really work." The phone's flash caught her eyes as she froze. "You don't belong in anyone's kitchen, yet you might belong on a bigger stage." The words rang softly but firmly, landing in Grace Parker's ears as she stirred her coffee, steam curling up in lazy ribbons. She glanced across the table at Rachel Hayes, studying the woman's carefully measured smile. The two women sat tucked in the corner of Ella's on Lennox, a cozy cafe in Harlem. Outside, late autumn leaves twirled along the sidewalk, their oranges and golds catching the low afternoon sun. Thanksgiving was just around the corner, and faint holiday decorations had begun to appear along shop windows. Grace wrapped her hands tighter around the warm cup. She was still getting used to being recognized again, but Rachel's presence was something new, different from the usual curious onlookers who whispered, "Is that her?" in passing. Rachel carried no judgment in her eyes, only purpose. "I know who you are, Grace," Rachel continued gently, "and I know what they did to you." Grace exhaled slowly. Everyone knows. The internet made sure of that. Rachel shook her head. No, they know the video, not the chef, not your story. For weeks now, Grace had been rebuilding her life day by day inside the Harlem community kitchen. The church basement had become her sanctuary, teaching neighborhood kids how to peel carrots, organizing stock shelves, finding rhythm again in chopping onions and simmering stews for families who couldn't afford luxury. Here she wasn't mocked or sidelined. She was Chef G. She belonged. But outside these walls, the echo of Whitmore and Company still shadowed her. The viral video, the whispered conversations, the glances that followed her into every room. David had been her steady rock through it all, never pushing her, but always reminding her, you don't have to stay small because they made you feel small. Now Rachel Hayes, polished and poised in her navy suit, had appeared inviting her for coffee without much explanation until now. I sit on the board for the New York Culinary Showcase, Rachel said, her voice soft but steady. It's not some flashy competition show. No cameras, no sponsors hovering over your station. It's the purest stage this city has to offer chefs from across New York, cooking what matters most to them. Grace frowned slightly. Why me? Rachel leaned forward, lowering her voice. Because you've already done something most chefs never do. You've made people feel something. And frankly, because it's time your food got to speak for itself, not through a viral clip or a scandal, but through your hands, your story. The words sat heavily between them. Grace stirred her coffee, not drinking, only listening to the spoon tapping the ceramic like a nervous heartbeat. I don't know, Grace whispered. I'm not sure I'm ready to stand in front of those people again. Not those people, Rachel corrected softly. Your people. Anyone who's ever felt erased. Silence lingered. The clink of cups and distant jazz from the cafe's speaker filled the pause. Finally, Grace looked up, eyes steady. I'll do it, but I'll cook my story. Rachel's lips curled into a warm smile. Good, because they've never tasted anything like you. That evening, Grace walked back home through the softly lit streets of Harlem. The storefronts glowed with string lights beginning to prepare for Christmas, and the cold air nipped gently at her cheeks. She passed the corner where the neighborhood kids always played, now empty, as families gathered inside against the chill. David greeted her at the door, his expression shifting the moment he saw her face. She didn't need to speak, he could see something had shifted. They want me to cook, she said quietly, after slipping off her coat. David tilted his head. For who? For everyone. He stepped closer, voice soft but filled with pride. Then let's start planning. Later that night, after David had fallen asleep, Grace sat by the small kitchen table with her grandmother's old recipe notebook spread open. The yellowed pages carried scribbled notes, oil stains, and faint pencil marks, all ghosts of meals that had once fed whole neighborhoods. She ran her fingers along the handwriting, remembering every Sunday in that warm Georgia kitchen where no one left hungry, no matter how little they started with. Her mind spun through flavors, textures, and stories, each one a thread she would weave into the plate. This wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about inheritance, not just hers, but every woman who stirred a pot before her, every hand that taught her to taste before she could even reach the stove. The next morning, she called Pastor Mildred at the community kitchen and shared the news. The older woman's voice beamed through the receiver. You go show them, child, Pastor Mildred said with a chuckle. But don't you forget, season with courage, not fear. Grace smiled, clutching the phone tighter. Always, Pastor. As she hung up, Grace exhaled deeply. For the first time in months, the knot that had lived inside her chest loosened just slightly. The fear was still there, but something steadier sat beneath it now. Not rage, not revenge. Readiness. You don't belong in anyone's kitchen, yet you might belong on a bigger stage. Rachel's words echoed once more as Grace picked up her knife and began her first prep for the showcase, steady, deliberate, and unafraid. The grand atrium of the New York Culinary Showcase pulsed with quiet intensity. Grace Parker stood at the entrance, her knife roll in hand, as rows of cooking stations stretched before her like miniature kingdoms. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Banners with the showcase's emblem hung along the high walls. Taste the story. Honor the craft. Judges circled with clipboards, sponsors whispered to assistants, and camera crews hovered discreetly in the background. David stood beside her, his hand warm against hers. "You good, no?" Grace whispered honestly. "But I'm ready." The showcase wasn't televised or driven by celebrity chefs seeking spotlights. Here, 20 carefully selected chefs from across the city presented dishes that told who they were. There were no elaborate teams, no gimmicks, just the chef, the food, and the story it carried. Grace was assigned a simple station at the far end. No elaborate display, no branding. Just a small black placard that read, "Grace Parker, Independent." It fit perfectly. She unpacked her knives with slow precision, laying each blade like sacred tools on the steel counter. Her ingredients followed red snapper, roasted corn, braised collard greens, black garlic cane syrup, and a handful of spices passed down from her grandmother's own rusted tin. Across the room, laughter rang out. Grace turned slightly and froze. There, surrounded by photographers, was Chef Philip Whitaker. He hadn't seen her yet. Dressed in monogrammed whites, flanked by his PR team, his table boasted gleaming equipment, truffle oil gold leaf, and imported microgreens. His polished station shimmered like the dining rooms he still ruled. David touched her shoulder gently. "Ignore him." Grace's hands tightened briefly before releasing the tension. She exhaled, grounding herself as the opening bell chimed. Margaret Hayes, standing on the small judge's platform, spoke into the microphone. "Today is not about competition. It's about truth, about food that carries memory, culture, and heart. Let the plates speak." The timer began. 90 minutes. Grace moved like a quiet current. The fish fillets were salted and air-dried, the roasted corn pureed until velvet smooth, braised collards simmered in duck fat with vinegar until tender. The glaze of black garlic and cane syrup reduced gently on low heat, dark as molasses but sharp with depth. Her station was a calm storm of motion. Around her, assistants plated for other chefs, PR agents hovered. But Grace worked alone, not from isolation, but intention. Every movement was deliberate. Every choice was her own. 30 minutes in, the aroma from her station began drawing glances. The cane syrup glaze sent sweet earthiness drifting through the air. A young sous chef 2 stations down whispered to another. "What is that?" someone murmured back. "That's her. The girl from the video. The one from Whitmore." Grace heard them, but her focus never wavered. She wasn't cooking for headlines, she was cooking for freedom. Midway through, Philip passed her station for the first time, stopping briefly. "Johnson," he smirked, voice smooth. "Didn't realize they allowed amateurs in." Grace kept stirring her glaze unfazed. Philip leaned in slightly. "Careful with the sugar. Wouldn't want it tasting like barbecue now, would we?" His condescension dripped as thick as his words. But Grace didn't answer. His insults slid off her like oil on steel. When time was called, servers carefully carried the plates to the judging platform. The judges, renowned chefs, critics, and community leaders, tasted each dish, their faces giving little away. When Grace's plate arrived, the room grew noticeably still. Her dish sat simple but proud, seared red snapper skin, perfectly crisp, resting on roasted corn puree, with braised collards beneath. A glossy drizzle of cane syrup, black garlic glaze crowned the fish. Pickled shallots and burnt paprika dust added a final whisper of brightness. Margaret Hayes tasted first. Her fork moved slowly. She took one bite, paused, then took another. The older judge beside her leaned forward, eyes curious. "What is this dish called?" one asked. Grace stepped forward, voice steady. "The Inheritance." "And its story," the judge prompted. Grace's throat tightened briefly, but her voice didn't shake. "It's the taste of Sunday afternoons on a porch in Georgia. My grandmother fed entire neighborhoods from a single pot. It's what we made when we couldn't afford a roast, but still shared something beautiful. It's a memory of not being seen, but still showing up with dignity, with flavor, with truth." A silence followed, thicker than before. Then Margaret set down her fork and began clapping. One by one, the other judges joined. The audience followed, filling the hall with genuine applause, not polite, not performative. Across the room, Philip stood frozen. His smile had vanished. His polished station now looked cold and overstaged beneath the warm applause surrounding Grace. The showcase ended with a small ceremony. Names were read, chefs thanked, but before closing, Margaret returned to the microphone. This year, she announced the board has chosen one chef to receive full sponsorship to develop their own culinary concept, not just because of excellence, but because their plate moved us. She paused, her eyes locking onto Grace's. "Grace Parker, will you join me?" The applause surged again. Grace froze for a brief moment, her breath catching. David squeezed her hand gently. "Go," he whispered. Grace walked forward slowly, heart pounding, head high. Margaret extended her hand with a smile that carried not sympathy, but respect. "I meant what I said," Margaret whispered, as Grace approached. "Your food told a story the city needed to hear, and now it's time they taste more." Grace nodded, words caught behind the lump in her throat. As the hall filled with applause once more, Philip stood in the corner, silent, his world dimming, while Grace's fire blazed forward. The building still smelled faintly of lemon oil, though most of the shine had dulled with time. Grace Parker stood outside the former Whitmore & Company, now her own a restaurant reborn. The brass sign above the door no longer bore Whitaker's name. In its place, polished but warm, read Hearth and Heritage. She slipped the key into the lock. It turned easily, like a quiet promise fulfilled. Inside, the space pulsed with life. Brass fixtures cast a soft honey glow against deep walnut tables. The open kitchen, free of barriers, hummed with steady rhythm as her team moved with practiced grace. The smell of simmering oxtail and roasted vegetables filled the air, mingling with quiet jazz, humming from hidden speakers. Photos lined one wall, her grandmother, great-auntie's women, who had taught her to taste before she could even reach the stove. Every plate here told not just her story, but theirs. The soft opening had been a quiet triumph. Neighborhood families filled tables alongside food writers and old church members. Pastor Mildred had given a short blessing that still rang in Grace's heart. And David, always steady, moved between tables, refilling sweet tea, his eyes shining with quiet pride. Tonight, Hearth and Heritage stood as a place where no one questioned who belonged. As the evening flowed, Grace plated dishes at the pass, sleeves rolled, hands steady. Her team moved like family, Andre now, her sous chef, Camille, running the line with quiet confidence, and a young Somali line cook who plated like an artist. Then the door opened, and a familiar cold gust swept through. Standing at the entrance, slightly hunched, was Philip Whitaker. For a moment the room seemed to pause. Conversations softened, but Grace kept plating, steadying her breath. She had known this day might come. Whitaker approached slowly, eyes scanning the warm space as if absorbing what had grown from what he once tried to erase. He stopped just short of the counter. "This place," he said, softly, voice thinner than she remembered, "it's remarkable." Grace looked at him fully for the first time in months. The arrogance had faded from his posture, replaced by something smaller. Regret, perhaps, or simply consequence. "Is that why you're here?" she asked, voice calm. He swallowed. "I came to see what I missed, and what I ruined." He glanced around again, pausing on the photographs on the open kitchen. His voice faltered. "I thought I was building a legacy. But you—" He exhaled. "You built something that matters." Grace wiped her hands on a towel, her tone even. "You built walls. I opened doors." Whitaker nodded, eyes glassy. "I pushed you out because I was afraid. You didn't fit my idea of a chef." Grace's gaze remained steady. "And you never cared to expand that idea." Silence stretched between them before he spoke again, voice breaking slightly. "I lost everything." Grace didn't flinch. "I lost more than a job. I lost my name. My dignity. You made me small in a room I helped hold up." "I know," he whispered. "And I came to ask, not for forgiveness, that's too easy, but how do I start again?" The room around them continued its gentle hum. Grace studied him. This wasn't the man who had once dismissed her plates like afterthoughts. This was someone cracked open by his own downfall. "You start by listening," she said. "Then you teach others not to become what you were." Whitaker nodded, something close to relief flickering across his face. "There's a community kitchen on Lenox," Grace added quietly. "They need someone to teach knife skills, misplaced humility." He looked surprised, then nodded again. "You'd trust me with that?" "No," Grace answered plainly. "But maybe the kids will." She handed him a small card, an address, a time. He held it like a fragile offering. Before leaving, he glanced around one last time. "This place, it feels like forgiveness." Grace shook her head gently. "No, it feels like the truth. Forgiveness is something you earn." Whitaker left into the cool night, the door shutting softly behind him. Grace turned back to her kitchen. Steam rose again. Plates stacked. Laughter returned. Across the room, David caught her eye and smiled. She exhaled deeply, breathing in roasted tomato and fresh thyme. Not bitterness, not pride, just warmth, the warmth of a fire built from everything they once tried to burn. The soft glow of hearth and heritage flickered against the cool evening air as Grace Parker stood quietly behind the pass, her hands steady, her eyes calm. The steady hum of the kitchen, the gentle laughter from diners, and the quiet clatter of plates were no longer sounds of pressure. They were the sounds of belonging. After all the years of silence, the dismissals, and the quiet humiliations, this place stood not as a monument to revenge, but as a sanctuary born from resilience. The journey that led her here was never about one viral video or one man's cruelty. It was about how the world often whispers to people like Grace, "You don't belong." But with each slice of red snapper, each simmering pot of collard greens, each note from her grandmother's recipes, Grace answered softly but firmly, "I do." And in doing so, she built a table where others too could pull up a chair without fear of being judged for their skin, their story, or their origin. It's a truth as old as the country itself, though we often forget it, in the noise of our busy lives, that talent is not reserved for one color, that brilliance does not wear only one face. In a world quick to label, and quicker still to dismiss Grace's journey, reminds us that dignity comes not from permission, but from quiet, consistent work, seasoned with courage, plated with love. Sometimes we forget how heavy an invisible weight can be. We forget how small, dismissive glances, unspoken judgments, or quiet exclusions can slowly suffocate dreams. But we are also reminded through stories like Grace's that injustice can be dismantled not only by grand speeches or protests, but by one person refusing to shrink. One person standing tall in a room that tried to make them small, and in doing so making space for others to stand too. Like the soft light of a kitchen late at night where someone stirs a pot with careful hands, the warm glow of justice often begins quietly. It simmers slowly, gathering strength, until one day it becomes undeniable, a fire that warms not only the one who built it, but those who gather close for comfort. So perhaps as you reflect on Grace's path, you might recall someone in your own life. A friend, a neighbor, maybe even yourself, who quietly carried more than anyone saw. Someone who simply needed one open door, one person to listen without judgment, one chance to serve what they carried inside. And if this story has found a quiet corner in your heart, consider passing it along not for likes or applause, but to remind someone else that their fire, though dimmed, can still burn bright. Sometimes a little warmth is all we need to keep walking forward.